On October 30th, 1944, in cloud over western Germany, the wing came off Hubert Zemke's Mustang. He had flown into a thunderhead. The turbulence inside it was violent enough to tear the airplane apart around him, and it did. Zemke got out, his parachute opened, and the American who had built the most feared fighter group in the 8th Air Force came down in a field belonging to the people he had spent 2 years hunting. He was 34. 17 3/4 victories, 154 combat sorties. 2 months earlier, he had handed over the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolf Pack, and taken command of the 479th. The Luftwaffe had known his name for a long time. Within days, he was at Oberursel, a few miles north of Frankfurt. Before the war, the place had been a small agricultural school. By that autumn, it was Auswärtsstelle West, Evaluation Center West, and almost every Allied airman brought down in the West passed through it before he ever saw a prison camp. The German who came to talk to him was a Hauptgefreiter, in American terms, roughly a corporal. His name was Hans Schaff, and he did not shout, and he did not threaten. He walked Zemke through the woods. He brought food. He asked after the injuries from the bailout. And at some point, he opened a folder and let the American colonel look inside. The folder held newspaper clippings about the 56th Fighter Group and the 479th. It held names, squadron commanders, the men Zemke had eaten breakfast with. It held details of the airfields in England. And on the desk, in a room in Nazi Germany, where an American colonel sat as a prisoner of war, there were copies of the Stars and Stripes that were 3 days old. 3 days. That was Zemke's own newspaper. The soldier's paper. The one printed for him and for every other American in the theater. Written not by the War Department, not by generals, but by enlisted men, privates, corporals, and sergeants who had been newspaper men before the army got them. Zemke never worked out what Scharf took from him. There was no doubt in his mind that the German had extracted something. He had not the slightest idea what. Scharf, he said, reminded him of an American insurance salesman who gets his foot in a door and leaves you holding a $10,000 policy. Before we go further, if you want more stories about what American soldiers and airmen actually came up against in this war, hit like and subscribe. It takes a second and it helps this channel. Now hold on to one thing because it comes back later and it matters more than anything else in this story. Nobody at Oberursel stole that newspaper. Nobody broke a code to get it. The Germans obtained the Stars and Stripes through neutral embassies, the way you would order a subscription. And they read it the way an intelligence officer reads anything, line by line, with a pencil. So let me show you what was actually on those pages. Take one issue, the Mediterranean edition, July 15th, 1944. An ordinary day, an ordinary paper. On those pages, you would find the 100th Battalion, the Hawaiian unit of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, named outright. You would find the 34th Division, 5th Army, the Cecina River, Leghorn. You would find Major Herschel H. Green, described as the top ace in the Mediterranean, from Mayfield, Kentucky. Lieutenant Paul Kerner of Pontiac, Illinois, up in a tank. Corporal Harold Myers of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, photographed somewhere in Normandy. Now read that again the way a man in Frankfurt read it. Name, rank, hometown, unit, sector. 4 lines of newsprint, and there is another card for the file. That was one issue. There was an issue the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, all the way from the spring of 1942 to the end. Somewhere in a filing room north of Frankfurt, that stack was becoming something. Not a rumor, not a guess, a record. And this was not some mimeographed sheet passed around to headquarters. By January of 1945, the Stars and Stripes was printing more than 1,200,000 copies a day, out of as many as 25 locations at once, following the armies across France and Belgium and into Germany. Sit with that number for a second. The army was printing more copies of that newspaper every single day than there were men in the entire 8th Air Force. And every page of it, every one, went past an American censor before it went to press. That is the part that stops you. This was not a leak, and it was not sloppiness. The rules existed, and they were specific. A fresh division could not be named until the enemy already knew it had arrived, which means somebody in an American uniform read the page about Major Green of Mayfield, Kentucky, and looked at it, and stamped it, and let it go. So the question underneath this whole story is not how German intelligence got hold of the paper. That part turns out to be easy. The question is why the United States Army, which understood perfectly well what a newspaper is worth to an enemy, went on printing one that its own privates wrote, and that Frankfurt could read inside 72 hours. There was an answer to that. It came from the top, from the one man in Europe with the authority to shut the paper down in a single afternoon. And it was one sentence long. The man was Dwight Eisenhower. And the sentence was this: "Stars and Stripes is the soldiers' paper, and we won't interfere." He said those words to a general who was trying to have the paper thrown out of his army's area altogether. We will get to that argument, because it happened in a headquarters in Luxembourg, and it is one of the strangest confrontations of the entire war. But the position behind the sentence was in place long before anyone said it out loud in a room. Censorship of the Stars and Stripes was limited to security, not tone, not embarrassment, not the dignity of officers. Security. So the American command knew what it was doing. It had decided that a soldier's newspaper was worth a certain amount of risk. And we have already seen the invoice for that risk, sitting on a desk in a converted agricultural school outside Frankfurt. To understand why they thought it was worth it, you have to see the paper the way the men who filled it saw it. So let me put you in an airplane. On February 26, 1943, a private named Andy Rooney was sitting in the nose of a B-17 over Wilhelmshaven. He was one of 8 reporters cleared to fly a combat mission over Germany. He had been given a week of training. That was the entire preparation. The flak found them. The plexiglass in the nose was shot away, and at 17,000 feet, the air that came through the hole was 50 degrees below zero. The bombardier tried to plug it, and his hands froze. Rooney got on a gun. He helped with a wounded man. He was a private in the United States Army with a notebook in his pocket, and he came home and wrote it down. It ran the next morning, February 27, 1943, under the headline, "How It Feels to Bomb Germany." Now here's the thing I want you to notice, and it is not sentiment. That story was true. Not approximately true. Not true in the way a communiqué is true. It was written by a man who had been in the airplane and who had no rank to protect and no career riding on how it read. Every soldier who picked up that paper could tell the difference, and so could every intelligence officer in Germany. That is the trap at the center of this story, and I want you to hold on to it. The very thing that made the Stars and Stripes worth reading to an American private is exactly what made it worth reading to a German analyst. Accuracy does not care who is holding the page. It cuts both ways, and it cut both ways every single day. And it went further than battle reports. The paper carried a column called the B-bag, which was where enlisted men sent their complaints. Food, passes, officers who ate better, rear area men with clean uniforms and better odds. The editor did not soften them, and he answered back. A soldier in Germany wrote home in October of 1944 that the B-bag was the part he read first, because the man running it had guts and came right back at them. So now put yourself at the other end of the pipeline. You are an intelligence officer north of Frankfurt, and every few days a bundle arrives through a neutral embassy, and inside it is a 1,000,000-copy newspaper in which the American soldier tells you, in his own words, what he has, where he is, who leads him, and what is wearing him down. By 1944, Oberursel was not a small operation. The staff ran to more than 300 people. The intelligence branch alone had 50 officers and 100 enlisted men, and 60 of the staff were specialists in one thing only: interrogation. In late 1943, the place was handling 1,000 prisoners a month. Through 1944, the average was 2,000. In July of 1944, the peak month, more than 3,000 Allied airmen and paratroopers came through the gate. The men doing the talking were chosen for three things: English, real English, the kind you get from living somewhere, not from a classroom. Scharf had spent 7 years in South Africa. His deputy, Sergeant Otto Engelhardt, had spent years in Canada and was known around the center as Canadian Wild Bill. Lieutenant Ulrich Hausmann, who handled bomber crews, had been a professor of English literature. Second, a manner. Several of the best interrogators at Oberösel were so friendly toward prisoners, so obviously concerned for their welfare, that the Gestapo began to wonder whether they were working for the other side. And third, memory. They took no notes while they talked, not one. A man writing things down reminds a prisoner that he is being interrogated, so they carried whole conversations in their heads for hours and wrote the report afterward. None of that would have worked without the folder. The folder was the weapon, and the folder was built, in large part, out of the newspaper that American privates wrote. Because what the Germans were really assembling at Oberösel was not a list of facts. It was an illusion, and it was aimed at one specific weakness in a man who has just been shot down. It worked so well that at least one exhausted American crewman, sitting across from a corporal who seemed to know everything already, said something about how his bomber could be attacked. What he said in that room changed the way German fighters came at American formations. And he almost certainly never knew he had said it. Start with what actually happened to an American airman when the gate closed behind him, because the folder was only the second half of the process. The first half was the cell. Solitary. 4 or 5 days was normal. 30 was available as punishment. The cells could be run hot until a man could not think straight. Cigarettes were taken away, and toilet articles, and Red Cross parcels. Interrogators told bomber crews they were murderers of children. Some were told they would be handed to the Gestapo unless they talked about their aircraft. One American captain, William N. Schwartz, was held in that place for 45 days. An American intelligence report written after the war put it in one line: "No amount of calculated mental depression, privation, and psychological blackmail was considered excessive." Before the door opened, there was usually a piece of paper. It looked like a Red Cross form. At the top, it asked for name, rank, and serial number, which is exactly what the Geneva Convention requires a prisoner to give. Underneath were other lines: home address, civilian occupation, unit, commanding officer. Most Americans saw it for what it was and refused. And here is the part that tells you how good these people were at their work. The refusal helped them too. A man who refuses has confirmed that he understands what is being asked, and he walks into the interview already convinced that the Germans have a system. Then the door opens, and a man walks in with cigarettes and a friendly face and asks how you are feeling. And then comes the folder. Inside it, the names of the men in his squadron, the location of his airfield, what his group had been doing and for how long, the name of his commanding officer, and, this is the detail that broke men, the name of the pub his squadron drank in. Stop on that one for a second. A pub in an English village. There is no radio intercept that gives you a pub. There is no aerial photograph of a pub. That detail exists in a German folder because somewhere, somehow, that information had been written down in a language they could read. And one of the places American units and American lives got written down, week after week, was the newspaper. One American who went through it said afterward that he felt shocked and sickened, that it was obvious somebody inside his own unit was feeding the Germans. Nobody was. That was the whole point. The method worked like this. Scharf would open with a question he already knew the answer to. Then he would answer it himself. then another, and answer that one too, until the American sitting across from him stopped believing there was anything left worth protecting. And then, somewhere in the middle of an easy conversation, would come the one question the Germans could not answer. And the man would answer it. Because what difference could it possibly make? Here is what that difference looked like. A bomber crewman told an interrogator which attack his crew feared most. High, and from the front. Because against a fighter coming in from 12 o'clock high, only the 2 guns of the B-17's top turret could be brought to bear. That went up the line, and the head-on pass became the way German fighters came at American formations. And there was worse. A captured Thunderbolt pilot, in what felt like ordinary conversation, gave away the range of the new P-47 drop tanks. Not a document, not a blueprint, a number in a chat. With that number, the German Home Defense Command could sit down with a map and calculate the exact point at which American escort fighters would have to turn for home. Think about what that means in the air. It means the Germans were not guessing anymore. They could hold their fighters back, watch the escorts peel away at the minute they had calculated, and hit a bomber formation at the moment it was alone. Men died over Germany because of a friendly conversation in a room with no notebook in it. So where did all of it come from? Not from spies. Every wrecked Allied aircraft was gone through for papers, letters, photographs, and for the operations orders that crews were not supposed to be carrying and carried anyway. Those became the squadron and group books. German women who spoke fluent English sat at receivers all day listening to American units talk, and by the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe had a remarkably accurate order of battle for the American air forces in Britain, complete with stations and call signs. But every one of those sources has the same defect. They go stale. A letter is from last month. A wreck tells you about a crew that is already dead. An order of battle drifts out of date the moment a group moves, a commander is promoted, a squadron is re-equipped. And that is the first real answer to what German intelligence found in the newspaper that American privates wrote. It was not secrets. It was the clock. It was the thing that kept the folder current. Which raises the question that turns this whole story around. If the paper was that useful to the Luftwaffe, the German army was reading it too, and for something bigger than airfields. In the autumn of 1944, German intelligence went looking in the stars and stripes for something no card index can hold. They went looking for what was happening inside the American soldier's head, and they found it in a column written by privates, printed with the Army's permission, and what they concluded from it may have been the single most expensive misreading of the entire war. Put yourself back at that desk north of Frankfurt with the bundle of newspapers and turn to the B bag. You are a German officer. You have been raised inside a system where the thing you are reading is a crime. I mean that literally. Under the German wartime penal code, signed in August of 1938, there was an offense called Wehrkraftzersetzung, the undermining of military strength. It was written so loosely that it covered everything from grumbling about the quality of the food to an unflattering remark about an officer. Roughly a fifth of all the death sentences handed down by Wehrmacht courts were for that offense. At least 5,000 German soldiers were sentenced to die for it. Now look at the page in your hands. American privates, in print, under their own names, complaining about their officers, about the food, about the men in the rear with the clean uniforms and the better odds, and an editor answering them back. In a newspaper, the American Army pays to print 1 million copies a day. There is only one conclusion available to a man reading that through German eyes. This army is coming apart at the seams. And its own command is so weak it cannot even stop the men from saying so. You do not need a German staff document to know they reached that conclusion. You can read it backwards, out of what they broadcast and what they printed and where they aimed it. German radio to American troops did not talk about tanks. It talked about the girl back home and the 4F who was taking her out while you sat in the mud. It talked about the officers who ate better than you did. It talked about how reasonable it would be to stop. That is not a message aimed at soldiers. That is a message aimed at the exact grievances printed in an American newspaper, read, filed, and handed to the propaganda staff. They fired it at the American line as well. Leaflets loaded 100 at a time into special artillery shells and shot over American positions in the Ardennes. And then, on December 16, 1944, Germany bet the last of its armor on the same idea. The Ardennes offensive was not really a plan to take ground. It was a plan to break something, to hit the Western Alliance hard enough at the seam that it would come apart, and to take Antwerp while the Americans and the British argued about whose fault it was. The whole thing rested on a judgment about the character of the enemy, on the belief that this was an army you could crack. And they took the study of Americans seriously. Otto Skorzeny put together a unit of English-speaking Germans, dressed them in American uniforms, and set up what his men called the School for Americans. They were drilled 2 hours a day on English. They watched American films and newsreels for the accent and the idiom. They were taught to eat the American way, knife down, fork switched to the right hand. They were taught not to snap to attention when an officer walks in, because Americans don't, and to slouch, because Americans do. Here's the number that gives the game away. Out of everyone they screened, they found 10 men with genuinely perfect English and real command of American idiom. 30 or 40 more spoke English well, but had no slang at all. 120 to 150 were moderate. 200 had schoolroom English. 10 men. That was the entire pool of Germans who could actually pass as American in conversation. So ask yourself where the other half of that problem gets solved. If you are trying to teach a German soldier how a current American soldier talks, in Germany, in 1944, what document do you have? Films are Hollywood and 2 years old. Textbooks are British. There was one source in the Reich that carried this month's American slang, written by American enlisted men, dated in bulk. It did not save them. On the morning of December 17, 1944, 3 men in American uniform drove up to the little bridge at Awil in Belgium. Guarding the bridge was a mixed group of American military police and Black American service troops, and one of them asked for the password. The answer was wrong. Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing, Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt. They were tried, convicted, and shot by firing squad on December 23rd. Under interrogation, they said their mission had been to reach Paris, gather at the Café de la Paix, and take or kill Eisenhower. And then the Americans did something no study of American manners could have prepared them for. The G's started quizzing each other, not on passwords, on the things they assumed only an American could know. State capitals, baseball scores, the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend. It got out of hand, and gloriously so. General Omar Bradley was stopped at a checkpoint and asked for the capital of Illinois. He said Springfield. He was correct. He was held anyway because the military policeman was sure it was Chicago. Hold that image, because it is the whole misreading in one picture. The Germans had spent months learning how an American holds a fork, and had read his complaints and concluded he was breaking. And the men who caught them were privates, the same privates whose grievances were printed every morning at Army expense. Which brings us back to the room at Oberwursel, and to a question the Germans never managed to answer. Because by the end of the war, American intelligence went back over what that center had actually extracted from thousands of American prisoners. The finding is one sentence long, and it is not the sentence you would expect. After the war, American intelligence went back through Oberwursel. The staff, the methods, the files, the results. And the judgment they reached about the thousands of American airmen who had passed through that place came down to a single line. Most of them withstood it. And they yielded no important military information other than name, rank, and serial number. And one more finding, which the Americans could have left out and did not. Reviewed in November of 1945, the German system at that center was judged to have stayed broadly within the Geneva Convention. There was slapping, there were threats. They were the exception, and the center's own commanders did not condone them. Sit with that for a moment, because it is doing two things at once. It is a verdict on the Germans. It is also a verdict on the Americans. And it raises a question that is much more interesting than the one we started with. If the folder was that good, if the illusion was that complete, why did it not work? Start with the man. Hans Scharf did not train for that job and did not want it. He had come out of a panzer unit into an interpreter's company. In the spring of 1943, he made a joke to an adjutant about spending the war punching holes in paper as a clerk, and was sent to the interrogation center at WWII, one of only 3 men allowed in that year. 2 senior interrogators had just been killed in an aircraft accident. That is the entire reason the most effective interrogator of the Second World War ended up in the chair. He never rose above Hauptgefreiter, a corporal, sitting across the table from American colonels, running rings around them. Now here's what happened when that man met Francis Gabreski. On July 20th, 1944, Gabreski was finished. 193 combat missions, 28 German aircraft shot out of the sky, more than any other American fighter pilot in Europe. His bags were packed, and he was waiting for the aeroplane home. He went up one more time. Low over an airfield near Bossenheim, strafing, he let the Thunderbolt get a few inches too low, and the tips of the propeller blades touched the ground. The airplane started to shake itself apart. He put it down on its belly, climbed out, and ran. He was loose in Germany for 5 days. Then they caught him, and he went to WWII, and Hans Scharf opened a folder in front of the leading American ace in Europe. And got nothing. Gabreski is one of the very few men who went through that room and gave the Germans nothing they could use. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft I at Barth on the Baltic until April of 1945. And now go back to Zemke, 3 months later, in the same building. Scharf gave him the full treatment. When Zemke came in hurt from the bailout, Scharf walked him personally to the hospital the Luftwaffe had taken over nearby. There were meals. There were walks in the woods, on the American's word of honor that he would not run. And there was the folder, the clippings on the 56th and the 479th, the names, the airfields. But this time something was different, and I do not think Scharf realized what he had done. Because he also put the stars and stripes on the table. 3 days old. Every other American who saw that folder was looking at the same terrible question. Who talked? Zemke was looking at the answer, in newsprint, right next to it. This is the thing about the whole system that nobody at WWII seems to have thought all the way through. The folder only works if the prisoner cannot account for it. Its power is not the information. Its power is the impossibility of the information. The sense that the Germans have got inside, that somebody has talked, that resistance is already pointless because the wall has already been breached. But a man who has been reading his own army's newspaper for 2 years has seen it before. He has seen his division named, and his commander named. He has seen a boy from his own town, with his hometown printed after his name, photographed in Normandy. So the folder does not read as German penetration. It reads as a scrapbook. And the moment an American works that out, the machinery stops turning, because the only thing holding it together was the illusion. Zemke never claimed he had beaten the man. He said there was no doubt Scharf had got something out of him, and that he had no idea what it was. Which is the honest version, and it is why the American report matters more than any single story. It does not say the Americans outwitted the Germans. It says that most of them, most of the time, held. Not because they were braver than other men, because the currency the Germans were spending, the sense of being uniquely exposed, uniquely known, had been devalued at home, on purpose, by an army that had decided its soldiers could be trusted with the truth about themselves. Which brings us to March of 1945, and to the most serious threat the Stars and Stripes faced in the entire war. It did not come from WWII. It did not come from the Luftwaffe. It came from an American, wearing 4 stars, commanding an American army in the field. And unlike every German who had read that newspaper, he had the power to stop it. He had already threatened to throw it out of his army's area, and he had summoned the sergeant he blamed to his headquarters in Luxembourg, alone, to explain himself. In March of 1945, a sergeant drove 36 hours in an open jeep across liberated Europe to be shouted at by a 4-star general. The sergeant was Bill Mauldin. He was 23 years old, he had a Purple Heart, and he drew 2 filthy, exhausted, unshaven infantrymen called Willie and Joe for the Stars and Stripes. He had come up through the 45th Division, and he drew the war the way an infantryman saw it. Every soldier in the European theater knew those 2 men. That was the problem. The general was George Patton, and he wanted the cartoons stopped. He believed they were destroying discipline. He believed that men who could shave were going around unshaven on purpose to look like Mauldin's characters. And he had made 2 specific threats. He would bar the Stars and Stripes from the Third Army's area, and if Mauldin came into that area again, he would put him in jail for 30 days. Stop and measure that against everything we have covered. German intelligence had been reading this newspaper for 3 years and had never once been able to touch it. Not one German who read it could stop a single line of it. An American general could shut it down inside his own army with a sentence. It was Eisenhower's naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, who suggested the 2 of them meet and clear the air. Patton agreed. And so, a 23-year-old sergeant was ordered to the headquarters of the 3rd United States Army in Luxembourg, alone. He turned up scrubbed, shaved, and saluting. What followed lasted about 45 minutes, and almost all of it was Patton talking. Mauldin got less than 2 minutes of it. Patton went at him about the pictures he drew of, and this is Patton's own phrasing, those god-awful things you call soldiers. He told him the cartoons were an invitation to mutiny. And then he made an argument that goes to the exact heart of this story, so listen to it carefully. The Bolsheviks, Patton said, made their officers dress like soldiers, eat with soldiers, no saluting, everybody calling everybody comrade. And where did it get them? While they ran an army like that, they couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. Now they've learned their lesson. They put uniforms back on their officers. That is a serious argument, made by a serious soldier, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Patton's position was that discipline is the thing that keeps men alive, and that anything corroding it, including a cartoon, including a complaints column, is a threat to the men themselves. Mauldin's answer, in the couple of minutes he was given, was simpler. The men had real grievances. The grievances existed whether or not anybody printed them. And a grievance with somewhere to go is not the same thing as a grievance with nowhere to go. The argument went up to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower ruled against Patton. Leave the cartoonist alone. The drawings gave the soldiers an outlet for what they were feeling, and the outlet was worth having. Stars and Stripes is the soldier's paper, and we won't interfere. That is the sentence we started with. Now you know where it was said, and what it cost to say it. Now understand what that decision actually was, because it was not sentimentality, and it was not a general being kind. Eisenhower had all the same information the Germans had. He knew what a newspaper is. His own censors were the ones stamping the pages with the unit names and the hometowns on them. Somewhere in his headquarters there were men whose whole job was worrying about what an enemy could take from open sources. He knew the paper crossed the line. He may not have known it crossed in 72 hours, but he knew. And he decided, in effect, that the intelligence the Germans could extract from an American soldier's newspaper was a smaller thing than what the American army would lose by taking it away. That is a bet. It is a real bet, with a real price, and we have already seen some of that price paid over Germany by bomber crews who ran into fighters that knew exactly when their escort would have to turn for home. Eisenhower made it anyway. As for Patton, on April 11th, 1945, Harry Butcher wrote one line in his diary about it, and you can hear him enjoying himself. It looks to me that General Patton may now admit he has lost the Battle of Mauldin. 2 months later, Malden, still a sergeant, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. The Army had not protected him because he was safe. It had protected him because he was right about the men. And here is where the German side of this story and the American side finally meet. Because a German intelligence officer reading the Stars and Stripes was not only collecting airfields and hometowns, he was looking, every single day, at proof of something his own system could not produce. He was reading an army that argued with itself in public, in wartime, at government expense, and did not fall apart. That was the real intelligence in that newspaper. It was on every page. It was free. And it was the one thing German intelligence could neither use, nor copy, nor report honestly up its own chain of command. In the next part, I want to show you what that cost them. Because there was a German colonel whose entire job was to tell the German high command the truth about the American and British armies. He is the man who should have been able to read that newspaper properly. 18 days before Hub Zemke's wing came off over Germany, his own government hanged him. His name was Alexis von Rona. He was a colonel, born in 1903, and his job was as important as any in the German war effort. He ran Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, the branch responsible for telling the German High Command the truth about the British and American armies. Order of battle, capability, intention. Every day, his section produced bulletins built out of prisoner interrogation, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercept, and press analysis. That last one is our newspaper. Everything we have followed in this story eventually flowed into von Rona's office. And from 1943 onward, the man in that office was deliberately lying. Von Rona consistently inflated the Allied order of battle. He overstated the strength of the British and American armies, on purpose, to mislead Hitler. And it worked. His numbers helped convince the German command that the invasion force was far larger than it was, and that there was still another army waiting to land somewhere else. Now hold both halves of this in your head at once, because it is the whole German intelligence problem in one man. At the bottom of that system, a corporal at Oberursel was assembling a folder of extraordinary accuracy out of an American newspaper and getting individual facts exactly right. At the top of that system, the officer whose job was to turn all of it into a picture of the enemy was handing his own leader numbers he knew were false. 3 weeks before the 20th of July, 1944, von Rohn learned that officers around Klaus von Stauffenberg intended to kill Hitler. He approved of it. He took no active part in it, and he did not report it. That was enough. He was tried in a show court and hanged at Plötzensee prison in Berlin on the 12th of October, 1944. 18 days later, Hub Zemke's wing came off over Germany. By the time Zemke was sitting in front of that folder, the man at the head of German assessment of the American army had been dead for 2.5 weeks, killed by his own government. The folder at Oberursel was still growing. Nobody at the top was in any position to tell Berlin what it actually meant. So now put the two systems next to each other, and the answer to our question comes out on its own. In one system, a 23-year-old sergeant draws cartoons that a 4-star general calls mutiny, and the supreme commander protects the sergeant. In the other system, the colonel responsible for describing that same army is hanged by his own state, and the intelligence apparatus goes on working around the hole where he used to be. And here is the part almost nobody knows, and it is the piece that finishes this. The complaints in that newspaper were not an accident the army tolerated. They were the visible edge of something the army had built on purpose. In October of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the War Department set up a research branch inside its morale division. The idea was almost strange for an army. Ask enlisted men what they think about their conditions, then summarize their answers and send them up the chain of command. Over the course of the war, Samuel Stouffer and his people surveyed more than 500,000 American soldiers. Promotions, rations, officers, what men believed about the enemy, what made a man keep going in combat. And the answers changed things. They shaped the awards system, They shaped the point system that decided which men went home first when it was over. And they shaped the content of the Stars and Stripes itself. So when a German officer opened the B-bag and read an American private complaining about his officers, he was not looking at an army falling apart. He was looking at a feedback system running normally. That is what German intelligence found in a newspaper that U.S. privates wrote. Not a weakness, not decay, a working part of a fighting army. They had the document in their hands. They read every line of it, and they could not see it because in their world, a soldier who wrote that letter could be shot for it. So the only meaning available to them was collapse. There is a letter I keep coming back to. In October of 1944, with the American army stalled on the German border in miserable weather, an American soldier wrote home about what he liked in the paper. Not the war news, the B-bag and the editorials. He said the man who ran that column got a mountain of complaints, and that he had guts, and that he came right back at them. That is a soldier in the middle of the hardest autumn of the war, taking pleasure in an argument. Not being managed, not being handled, arguing, and enjoying that somebody was arguing back. You cannot fake that. You cannot manufacture it in a propaganda company. And you certainly cannot extract it from a prisoner in a cell, however good you are. Which leaves one last thing to settle, and it is the strangest turn in the whole story. Because the war ended, and the Americans went to WWII, and they found the interrogation center burned and abandoned, and its people scattered. They tracked down the commandant. They looked for the corporal who had run rings around their colonels. And what the United States did with Hans Schaff when they found him is not what you would expect. Within 3 years, he was standing in front of American officers, invited, and what he ended up doing for the rest of his life is something you have almost certainly seen with your own eyes. They found the commandant, Oberstleutnant Erich Killinger, sitting in an ordinary army prisoner cage. The interrogation center itself was gone, records burned or carted away, the staff scattered toward Nuremberg with whatever they could carry. The man who had run that place spent the end of the war being processed by the army whose airmen he had processed for 5 years. And Hans Schaff, the corporal with the folder, was invited to the United States. In 1948, he came over to testify in the treason trial of an American who had gone to the other side. And then, the United States Army did something that tells you how seriously they took what had happened in that room at WWII. They put him in front of their own intelligence officers at the Pentagon and asked him to explain how he did it. His methods went into the American interrogation school, not the cell. Not the cold and the threats and the Gestapo talk. The American report had already found that most men withstood all of that and gave up nothing. What went into the curriculum was the other thing, the sympathetic listener, the walk in the woods. The oldest and least violent idea in the business, that a man who has just been through the worst hour of his life wants to talk to somebody. Scharf stayed. He became an American, and he spent the second half of his life making mosaics, glass and stone, set by hand. His work is in the California state capitol. It is at Epcot. If you have ever walked through the archway inside Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World and looked at the mural on the wall, you have stood in front of work by the man who interrogated Gabreski and Zemke. He died in California in September of 1992. Gabreski came home. He flew again in Korea and finished the only way that man was ever going to finish, as one of the very few Americans to be an ace in 2 wars. He died in 2002. Zemke came home too. 17 3/4 victories, 154 combat sorties, and a winter in Stalag Luft I at Bart on the Baltic before the war let go of him. Bill Mauldin got his Pulitzer at 23 and drew for another 50 years. When he died in 2003, the Stars and Stripes headline called him what he had been for 60 years. Friend of the GIs, the man who created Willie and Joe. And the private who flew to Wilhelmshaven with a notebook, Andy Rooney spent the rest of his life on American television, arguing with everybody, which is exactly what he had been hired to do in 1942. And the newspaper is still there. It came out of London in April of 1942 as an 8-page weekly put together by enlisted men, and it never stopped. It followed the armies into Germany, and it did not stop when the shooting did. It is still publishing. Now go back one last time to that room north of Frankfurt, in the first days of November 1944. An American colonel is sitting there, hurt and captured, and a German corporal is showing him a folder because he wants him to feel that everything is already known. And beside the folder, on the desk, is a stack of American newspapers, 3 days old. Scharf thought he was showing Zemke the reach of German intelligence. What he was actually showing him was the United States Army printing more than 1 million copies a day of a paper it did not control, written by men who could not be fired and could not be silenced, carrying their names and their hometowns and their complaints, and shipping it forward every morning to the men in the line. That is the answer, and it is simple enough to say in one breath. German intelligence went looking in that newspaper for what the American army had. What was actually printed there, every single day, was why it worked. They collected the first and never understood the second, and the war went the way it went. A folder can hold a name, an airfield, a commanding officer, the pub on the corner. There is no card in any index anywhere for an army that lets its privates print the truth about it. And the last thing worth saying is not about the folder or the colonel or the corporal. It is about a private somewhere in France or Belgium in the winter of 1944, cold and filthy and a long way from Lancaster or Pontiac or Mayfield, who picked up a 4-page paper written by men exactly like him, read a complaint he agreed with, saw somebody answer it, and went back to work. Nobody had asked him to be quiet. That was the deal his army had made with him, and he kept his end of it all the way to the Rhine. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this told you something you did not know about the American soldier and the army he served in, please hit the like button. It is a single thing that decides whether a story like this reaches anyone else. Subscribe and turn on the bell, and the next one will find you. And tell me 2 things in the comments. First, where you are watching from. Second, if your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Second World War, give me his name and his unit. Put it down here where it can be read. Somebody will read it.